In the darkest corridors of Hampton Court Palace, where tapestries concealed more than cold stone walls, a king's insatiable appetite would reshape an entire nation. Henry VIII's sexual obsessions didn't merely destroy 6 marriages, they dismantled centuries of religious tradition, severed England from Rome, and left a trail of executed queens and discarded mistresses that would horrify even the most hardened Tudor courtiers. This is not merely a tale of royal excess, but a chronicle of how one man's carnal compulsions became instruments of state terror, transforming bedchambers into courtrooms and wedding vows into death sentences. The young Henry Tudor ascended to the throne in 1509 as a golden prince, athletic, educated, and seemingly devoted to his Spanish bride, Catherine of Aragon. Contemporary accounts describe a monarch who could have stepped from the pages of chivalric romance, with his auburn hair, imposing 6-foot frame, and remarkable prowess in the tilting yard. Yet beneath this glittering facade lurked appetites that would grow increasingly monstrous with each passing year. Even in those early days, court observers noted the king's wandering eye and his peculiar belief that sexual virility was divinely ordained proof of his right to rule. England in the early 16th century was a realm bound by strict Catholic doctrine, where marriage was sacred and adultery could mean social ruin. The Tudor court, however, operated by different rules, a glittering, dangerous world where proximity to power meant everything, and royal favor could elevate or destroy. Within this hothouse atmosphere, Henry's sexual pursuits became a deadly game that few could refuse to play. Ladies-in-waiting found themselves caught between honoring their marriage vows and risking the king's potentially lethal displeasure. The practice of keeping official mistresses was common among European monarchs, but Henry elevated it to an art form of cruelty and manipulation. Unlike his French counterpart Francis I, who maintained his mistresses with a certain civilized discretion, Henry pursued his conquests with the subtlety of a battering ram. He would publicly humiliate Queen Catherine by parading his lovers before her, forcing her to maintain her dignity while her ladies, some barely out of childhood, emerged from his chambers with telltale gifts of jewels and estates. The king's sexual mythology was carefully cultivated through court propaganda and his own delusions. He genuinely believed that his virility was a divine gift, that God had chosen him not merely to rule England, but to demonstrate masculine supremacy through conquest, both on the battlefield and in the bedchamber. This twisted theology would later provide justification for his break with Rome. After all, if God had blessed him with such appetites, surely the Pope's refusal to annul his marriage was heretical interference with divine will. Catherine of Aragon endured 24 years of public humiliation with a dignity that only seemed to enrage her husband further. The Spanish princess had committed the unforgivable sin of aging, of suffering multiple miscarriages, of failing to produce the male heir that Henry convinced himself was his divine right. Court records detail how the king would visit her chambers less and less frequently, while his parade of mistresses grew ever younger and more numerous. The queen was forced to smile and welcome these women into her household, knowing full well the nature of their service to the crown. Among the earliest documented mistresses was Elizabeth Blount, known as Bessie, who bore Henry his first acknowledged bastard son in 1519. The king's joy at finally producing a healthy male child, even an illegitimate one, was so extreme that he nearly legitimized the boy, creating him Duke of Richmond and showering him with honors that should have belonged to a prince. This public acknowledgement of his adultery was a calculated insult to Catherine, a demonstration that the fault for their lack of male heirs lay with her, not with his sacred seed. But it was the arrival of the Boleyn sisters that would transform Henry's sexual obsessions from private vice to public catastrophe. Mary Boleyn, the elder sister, was by all accounts a willing participant in the royal bed, earning the cruel nickname the Great Whore from those who resented her influence. She bore the king at least one child, possibly two, though Henry never acknowledged them as he had Richmond. Mary understood her role, to provide pleasure without making demands, to accept her gifts gracefully, and to disappear when the royal eye wandered elsewhere. The king's treatment of Mary Boleyn established a pattern that would repeat throughout his reign. Initial passionate pursuit, lavish gifts and promises, intense sexual possession, and then abrupt dismissal when pregnancy or boredom set in. These women were not persons to Henry, but objects, chess pieces in his endless game of dynastic succession and personal gratification. When Mary's usefulness ended, she was married off to a minor courtier and effectively exiled from court. Her children's royal parentage, an open secret that no one dared acknowledge. Then came Anne Boleyn, and with her arrival, Henry's sexual obsessions took on a new, more dangerous dimension. Unlike her sister, Anne refused to become just another royal mistress. She had witnessed Mary's fate, seen how quickly the king's passion could turn to indifference. Anne played a longer, more dangerous game, withholding her sexual favors while inflaming the king's desire through wit, intelligence, and carefully orchestrated glimpses of what he could not have. For 7 years, she kept the most powerful man in England in a state of frustrated desire that drove him to literal reformation. The sexually explicit letters Henry wrote to Anne during their courtship survive as testament to his obsessive nature. In one, he writes of wanting to kiss her breasts, which he calls her pretty duckies, and expresses his desperate wish to be in her arms. These letters, shocking for their time, reveal a king reduced to a begging schoolboy, promising Anne the world if she would only satisfy his lust. The power dynamic had shifted. For the first time in his life, Henry was the pursuer rather than the pursued, and it drove him to extremes that would reshape Christianity itself. The king's desire for Anne became so all-consuming that he was willing to break with 1,000 years of religious tradition to possess her. The annulment proceedings against Catherine of Aragon dragged on for 6 years, during which Henry's sexual frustration reached fever pitch. Court observers noted his increasingly erratic behavior, his violent mood swings, and his growing paranoia. He began to see enemies everywhere, convinced that those who opposed his remarriage were deliberately thwarting God's will as expressed through his royal loins. By 1533, with Anne finally in his bed and pregnant with what he assured everyone would be a son, Henry had broken from Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and effectively legalized his own adultery by retroactively declaring his marriage to Catherine invalid. The sexual had become political, the personal had become theological. His obsession with Anne had cost England its place in Catholic Europe, but Henry saw it as liberation. Now, no priest or pope could tell him whom he could bed or wed. The birth of Elizabeth, instead of the promised son, marked the beginning of Anne's doom. Henry's sexual passion, so long frustrated, had burned itself out with terrifying speed. Within months of their marriage, he was already pursuing Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. The pattern was repeating, but this time with deadly consequences. Anne, unlike Catherine, had no powerful foreign relatives to protect her. She had risen too high and made too many enemies. When Henry tired of her, she could not simply be divorced. She had to be destroyed. The charges against Anne Boleyn reveal the truly monstrous nature of Henry's sexual pathology. Not content with simply removing her, he needed to annihilate her completely, to transform her from queen to whore in the public imagination. She was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, charges so ludicrous that even Henry's own judges struggled to make them stick. The message was clear. If the king's sexual desires had made her queen, his sexual disgust could unmake her entirely. Her execution in 1536 sent a chilling message to every woman in England. Jane Seymour barely had time to comprehend her elevation before she was pregnant with the future Edward VI. She died 12 days after childbirth, perhaps the luckiest of Henry's wives, in that she escaped before his affections could curdle into hatred. The king's grief seemed genuine, but it didn't stop him from immediately beginning the search for wife number 4. His advisors, increasingly aware of their master's dangerous sexual appetites, began scouring Europe for a bride who could satisfy both diplomatic needs and royal lust. The debacle of Anne of Cleves reveals another aspect of Henry's sexual neuroses: his need for immediate physical attraction and his violent reaction when it was absent. The German princess, selected based on a flattering portrait, arrived in England to find a king who took one look at her and declared her unbeddably ugly. His claimed inability to consummate the marriage became a matter of state discussion, with physicians and courtiers forced to debate the king's sexual performance in official proceedings. The humiliation Anne endured, being physically rejected and publicly declared repulsive, was merely another manifestation of Henry's belief that his sexual preferences were matters of national importance. While the Cleves annulment was progressing, Henry had already fixed his lustful gaze on Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn's teenage cousin. Here, the king's sexual predations reached their most disturbing nadir. Catherine was likely no more than 15 when the 49-year-old king began pursuing her, and possibly younger when she was first brought to court specifically to catch his eye. The Howard family, having learned from the Boleyn example, pushed their young relative forward, essentially trafficking a child to satisfy an aging tyrant's desires. Catherine Howard's story is perhaps the most tragic of all Henry's victims. A girl who had already been sexually exploited by older men in the Howard household, she was thrust into the bed of a king who by now was grossly obese, suffering from a suppurating leg wound, and increasingly paranoid. Court accounts suggest she was terrified of him, but forced to play the role of the eager young bride. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who had at least possessed the maturity and intelligence to navigate court politics, Catherine was a child playing a deadly adult game. The king's sexual delusions reached their peak with Catherine Howard. He convinced himself that this teenager genuinely desired him, that their physical relationship was proof of his continued virility despite his declining health. He showered her with jewels and called her his rose without a thorn, apparently blind to the terror in her eyes. When evidence of her premarital relationships emerged, relationships that today we would recognize as child abuse, Henry's reaction was volcanic. The idea that his pure young bride had been touched by others shattered his fantasy. Catherine's execution in 1542 marked a turning point in Henry's sexual reign of terror. She went to the block after allegedly practicing how to lay her head properly, a child trying to die with dignity. Her lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, who had testified against her own husband to help Henry destroy Anne, was executed alongside her, a reminder that in Henry's sexual games, even accomplices were ultimately disposable. The court watched in horror as yet another queen was butchered for failing to meet the king's impossible standards. By the time Henry married Catherine Parr in 1543, his sexual appetites had been largely curtailed by physical infirmity. Weight that likely exceeded 400 pounds, chronic leg infections, and possible diabetes had reduced the once athletic king to a wheezing invalid. Yet even then, Catherine Parr lived in fear. She had seen what happened to wives who displeased Henry, and she carefully navigated his moods, playing nurse rather than lover, mother rather than wife. Even so, she narrowly escaped charges of heresy when her religious opinions annoyed him. The infrastructure of Henry's sexual obsessions extended far beyond his official wives. Court records hint at numerous unnamed women who suffered his attentions, servants who couldn't refuse, minor nobility whose families saw opportunity in royal bastards, and foreign visitors who found themselves propositioned by a king who saw sexual conquest as diplomatic victory. The lucky ones received payoffs and disappeared into obscurity. The unlucky ones, who fell pregnant or spoke too freely, often met darker fates. One of the most chilling aspects of Henry's sexual practices was his use of religious authority to justify them. Having made himself head of the church, he could literally rewrite divine law to suit his desires. Adultery was a sin for others, but divinely sanctioned for him. His subjects were forced to accept each new marriage as God's will, even as the bodies of previous wives were still warm in their graves. Priests who refused to acknowledge his marriages found themselves burned as heretics, creating a perverse situation where sexual submission to the king became a matter of religious orthodoxy. The king's obsession with producing a male heir turned every sexual encounter into a matter of state importance. His wives were reduced to breeding stock, their value measured solely in their ability to produce princes. The tragic irony was that Henry's desperate seed scattering produced only one legitimate son who survived to adulthood, and Edward VI died at 15. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, whom he had bastardized and legitimized according to his marital whims, would both rule England, proving that his sexual obsessions had been ultimately pointless. The psychological impact on Henry's children was profound. Mary Tudor grew up watching her mother humiliated and discarded, developing a harsh, unforgiving nature that would manifest in her burning of Protestants. Elizabeth, whose mother was executed when she was not yet 3, remained unmarried for life, perhaps having learned too well the dangers of surrendering to men's desires. Even Edward, the precious male heir, grew up in a court where he watched his father dispose of women like soiled garments. Beyond the palace walls, Henry's sexual practices had created a culture of fear and opportunism. Noble families began treating their daughters as potential sacrifices, grooming them for royal attention while secretly praying they would escape it. The entire English nobility became complicit in what amounted to systematic sexual exploitation. Those who protested, like Thomas More, lost their heads. Those who participated, like Thomas Cromwell, eventually lost theirs too when they outlived their usefulness to the king's desires. The international ramifications were equally severe. Henry's break with Rome over his divorce isolated England from Catholic Europe. His treatment of Catherine of Aragon poisoned relations with Spain for generations. His rejection of Anne of Cleves damaged ties with German Protestant states. Every sexual whim had diplomatic consequences, as foreign courts watched in horror while the English king murdered wives and declared himself God's sexual representative on earth. The legal precedents established during Henry's reign were particularly disturbing. Laws were literally rewritten to facilitate his marriages and execute his wives. The concept of treason was expanded to include adultery against the king, making royal sexual dissatisfaction a capital crime. The Succession Acts were rewritten multiple times, bastardizing and legitimizing children based on their mother's current status in the king's bed. English law became subordinate to royal lust. Medical historians have speculated about the physical causes of Henry's sexual obsessions. Some suggest that a jousting accident in 1536 caused brain damage that exacerbated his tyrannical tendencies. Others point to possible syphilis, though evidence is limited. What seems clear is that absolute power combined with religious authority and sexual appetite created a perfect storm of exploitation and murder that masqueraded as divine right. The remnants of Henry's sexual obsessions lingered long after his death in 1547. The Church of England, born from his desire for Anne Boleyn, became a permanent fixture of English life. The precedent of royal supremacy over religious matters, established to facilitate his divorces, would contribute to civil wars and constitutional crises for centuries. The Tower of London remained haunted by the ghosts of his sexual victims, 2 queens and countless lesser women who had died for failing to satisfy a king's impossible demands. Modern historians have attempted to contextualize Henry's behavior within Tudor norms, but even by the standards of his time, his sexual practices were extreme. Other monarchs kept mistresses, but few murdered wives with such regularity. Other kings sought annulments, but none broke from the universal church to get one. Henry's sexual obsessions were not merely personal failings, but weapons of state terror that he wielded against anyone who stood between him and his desires. The tragedy of Henry VIII's sexual practices lies not just in the immediate victims, but in the generational trauma they caused. Noble families were torn apart, with brothers testifying against sisters and fathers sacrificing daughters. The Howard family alone saw 2 queens executed and numerous relatives imprisoned or killed. The very fabric of English society was rewoven to accommodate one man's uncontrollable appetites. Perhaps most disturbing was Henry's complete lack of remorse. Even on his deathbed, he showed no sign of repenting the murders committed in his sexual pursuit. He went to his grave, apparently believing that God had sanctioned every execution, every broken marriage, every life destroyed in service to his desires. In his mind, his sexual will and divine will were one and the same, a delusion that cost thousands of lives and changed the course of English history. The cultural impact extended to art and literature. Portraits of Henry's wives were destroyed or hidden, their very images considered dangerous. Writers learned to navigate carefully around topics of marriage and sexuality, knowing that the wrong word could be interpreted as criticism of the king's practices. The rich tradition of courtly love poetry was replaced by careful propaganda that celebrated whatever marriage currently had royal favor. Henry's sexual legacy poisoned the English monarchy's relationship with marriage for generations. His daughter Elizabeth I's famous virginity can be read as a direct response to her father's excess. The Stuart kings who followed struggled with the precedent of royal divorce, contributing to the civil wars that would temporarily end the monarchy itself. Even today, the British royal family navigates marriage and divorce with one eye on the Tudor precedent. The physical spaces where Henry conducted his sexual pursuits became monuments to his victims. Hampton Court Palace, where he honeymooned with multiple wives, is said to be haunted by Catherine Howard's screaming ghost. The Tower of London draws tourists eager to stand where Anne Boleyn lost her head for failing to produce a son. These locations serve as dark reminders that behind the tourist-friendly Tudor history lies a reality of sexual exploitation and judicial murder. Economic historians have calculated the staggering cost of Henry's sexual obsessions. The break with Rome meant the loss of church revenues. The executions of prominent nobles destroyed wealthy families and redistributed their assets. The constant marriage negotiations and ceremonies drained the royal treasury. England's economy was literally reshaped to accommodate the king's bedroom desires, with monasteries dissolved partly to fund his matrimonial adventures. The intellectual climate of England was similarly warped. Scholars who might have contributed to Renaissance learning instead spent their energy justifying the king's marriages or defending his religious innovations. The nascent Protestant Reformation in England became inextricably linked with royal sexuality, as theological arguments were crafted primarily to support Henry's desire to remarry. Academic discourse was reduced to sexual apologetics. Women's status in Tudor England, already precarious, was further undermined by Henry's example. If the king could execute queens on trumped-up charges, what protection did ordinary women have? The message was clear. Women existed to serve male desire, and even the highest position offered no security. The brief moment of female power represented by Queen's Consort was revealed as entirely contingent on maintaining male sexual interest. The international perception of England shifted dramatically due to Henry's sexual practices. Once seen as a civilized Christian kingdom, England became viewed as a rogue state where the king's bedroom whims overruled law and tradition. Foreign ambassadors reported back in shock about the latest execution or marriage. England's reputation as a barbarous nation where queens were routinely murdered took centuries to overcome. Henry's own writings reveal the depth of his sexual delusions. His theological treatises, attempting to justify his actions, show a mind capable of extraordinary intellectual gymnastics. He could argue simultaneously that his marriage to Catherine was invalid because she had been his brother's wife, while his marriage to Anne was invalid because he had slept with her sister. Logic bent to accommodate desire, and thousands of Englishmen were forced to pretend these contradictions made sense. The medical details of Henry's later sexual life paint a picture of grotesque determination. Despite legs that oozed pus, obesity that made walking difficult, and probable impotence, he continued to pursue young women. Catherine Parr's accounts suggest a man desperate to prove virility he no longer possessed, subjecting his final wife to humiliating attempts at intimacy that were more about power than pleasure. The religious ramifications extended beyond England's borders. Henry's break with Rome contributed to the fragmentation of Western Christianity. Wars would be fought, with hundreds of thousands dead, partly as a consequence of one king's inability to control his sexual urges. The Protestant Reformation, a complex theological and political movement, became forever tainted by its association with Henry's matrimonial troubles. Even Henry's death reflected his sexual obsessions. He was buried next to Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his precious son. Catherine of Aragon and Anne of Cleves, the wives who survived him, were notably not included in his funeral plans. Even in death, he was ranking women by their sexual usefulness to him. His will made provisions for masses to be said for his soul, apparently unaware of the irony that he had destroyed the very religious infrastructure that might have provided them. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death saw a careful rehabilitation of his victims. Catherine Parr quickly remarried, suggesting her marriage to Henry had been more survival strategy than love match. Anne of Cleves, who had wisely accepted her divorce, lived comfortably as the king's beloved sister, having learned that survival meant accepting whatever role Henry assigned. The dead queens could not be so easily rehabilitated, their names remaining charged with dangerous associations. Modern forensic examination of the evidence against Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard reveals just how flimsy the cases were. The trials were showpieces, with verdicts decided before evidence was presented. The specific sexual charges, adultery with multiple men, incest, homosexual activities, were clearly chosen for maximum humiliation rather than any relationship to truth. Henry weaponized sexuality itself, turning natural human desires into capital crimes when convenient. The psychological profile that emerges is of a malignant narcissist with sexual compulsions, enabled by absolute power and religious authority. Henry showed no empathy for his victims, no recognition that they were human beings rather than objects for his gratification. His ability to have women executed and then immediately pursue others suggests a complete disconnect from normal human emotion, a sociopathy expressed through sexual domination. The artistic legacy includes not just portraits and palaces, but a rich tradition of historical fiction attempting to understand Henry's victims. From the earliest ballads about Anne Boleyn to modern novels and television series, creators have tried to restore humanity to women Henry reduced to sexual objects. These works serve as a form of cultural memory, ensuring that Catherine Howard is remembered as more than just a foolish girl, and Anne Boleyn as more than a scheming seductress. Legal scholars still study Henry's reign as a cautionary tale about the intersection of sexual desire and legal authority. The ease with which laws were rewritten to facilitate royal marriages demonstrates the fragility of legal systems when confronted with determined autocrats. The principle that law should apply equally to all, regardless of station, was shattered by a king who made his bedroom the supreme court of the land. The economic exploitation extended beyond the dissolution of the monasteries. Henry's sexual pursuits created a marketplace where noble families essentially prostituted their daughters for advancement. The Boleyn family's rise and catastrophic fall demonstrated both the opportunities and dangers Families invested fortunes in placing daughters at court, grooming them for royal attention, creating an economy of sexual exploitation dressed up as social climbing. Henry's impact on English masculinity was equally toxic. He modeled a version of manhood based on sexual conquest and domination, where virility was proved through possession of multiple women and destruction of those who disappointed. This template of toxic masculinity, endorsed by royal example and religious authority, would influence English gender relations for generations. Men learned that sexual desire justified any cruelty. The international marriage market was permanently altered. Foreign princesses became reluctant to marry English kings, knowing the fate of Catherine of Aragon and Anne of Cleves. The traditional role of queens as peace weavers between nations was undermined when it became clear that English kings might execute or humiliate foreign brides. Diplomatic marriages, once the cornerstone of international relations, became fraught with new dangers. Henry's sexual practices created a culture of surveillance and paranoia that extended throughout society. Servants spied on their masters, courtiers reported private conversations, and bedchamber activities became matters of state intelligence. The boundary between public and private dissolved when royal sexual satisfaction became a national security issue. Everyone from laundresses to ladies-in-waiting could find themselves interrogated about what they had seen or heard. The theological gymnastics required to justify Henry's marriages had lasting effects on English Christianity. The Church of England developed a uniquely flexible approach to divorce and remarriage, shaped by its founding trauma. Scripture was interpreted and reinterpreted to support whatever the monarch desired. This theological flexibility, born from sexual expediency, would ironically contribute to England's later reputation for religious tolerance. Educational institutions were reshaped by Henry's obsessions. The universities, once focused on producing Catholic clergy, were reformed to create lawyers and theologians who could argue for royal supremacy in all matters, including sexual ones. The curriculum shifted to emphasize subjects useful for justifying royal desires. Classical texts were mined for precedents supporting divorce and remarriage, while inconvenient biblical passages were explained away. The impact on childhood and youth was particularly severe. Noble children grew up knowing they might be sacrificed to royal lust. Young women were trained from early age in the accomplishments that might catch a king's eye, while simultaneously being warned of the dangers. The natural innocence of youth was corrupted by the need to navigate a court where children could become queens or corpses based on an aging king's whims. Henry's legacy includes the normalization of state violence in service of personal desire. He demonstrated that with sufficient power, any crime could be legalized, any murder justified, any cruelty sanctioned. The apparatus of state, parliament, courts, church, all bent to accommodate royal lust. This precedent of institutional compliance with autocratic excess would echo through English history, contributing to the civil wars that would eventually limit monarchical power. The demographic impact was subtle but real. Noble families began limiting their daughters' exposure at court, keeping them in the countryside rather than risk royal attention. The traditional system where young nobles were educated in royal households was disrupted by parental fear. The very structure of aristocratic society was altered by the need to navigate around one man's sexual dangers. Modern psychological analysis suggests Henry suffered from what would today be diagnosed as multiple personality disorders exacerbated by traumatic brain injury. His ability to compartmentalize, to order an execution in the morning and feast jovially that evening, indicates severe dissociation. His sexual compulsions appear to have been one of the few constants in an increasingly fragmented psyche, providing a through line of destructive consistency. The cultural memory of Henry's reign created lasting archetypes. The lustful tyrant, the disposable queen, the scheming family pushing forward a sacrificial daughter. These became standard figures in English cultural imagination. Every subsequent royal scandal would be measured against the Tudor example. The phrase divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived became a schoolyard rhyme, reducing systematic sexual exploitation and murder to a memorable chant. The physical remnants of Henry's obsessions persist in unexpected ways. Archaeological excavations at Tudor sites reveal hastily altered buildings, Queen's emblems chiseled away and replaced, physical spaces repeatedly reimagined for each new wife. The very architecture bears witness to the instability created by royal sexual whims. Palace inventories show the frantic redistribution of jewels and goods as wives rose and fell. Henry's sexual legacy influenced English law enforcement and justice systems. The expansion of treason to include personal betrayal of the monarch created precedents for political prosecutions based on private behavior. The use of torture to extract sexual confessions, particularly in Catherine Howard's case, normalized judicial brutality. The principle that justice should be blind was abandoned when the king's bedroom was involved. The final accounting of Henry VIII's sexual practices must include not just the famous victims, but the countless unnamed ones. For every executed queen, there were dozens of women who suffered his attentions and survived only by luck or cleverness. For every documented mistress, there were servants and subjects whose stories were never recorded. The true scale of his sexual predation will never be known. As the Tudor age gave way to the Stuart era, England slowly began to recover from the trauma of Henry's reign. The judicial murder of wives became unthinkable. The principle that royal marriages required parliamentary approval was established. The Church of England evolved beyond its origins as an instrument of royal divorce. Yet the scars remained, visible in the careful way subsequent monarchs navigated marriage and in the permanent separation of English Christianity from Rome. Today, visitors to Tudor sites walk through rooms where systematic sexual exploitation was state policy. They admire portraits of women who lived in terror, see jewels that were bribes for sexual compliance, tour palaces built with wealth stolen from dissolved monasteries. The sanitized heritage industry presents Henry as a colorful character, rather than a sexual predator whose appetites reshaped a nation. The truth remains darker and more complex than any tourist narrative. The lessons of Henry VIII's sexual obsessions remain relevant. They demonstrate how personal pathology, when combined with unlimited power, can destroy institutions and lives. They show how entire societies can be complicit in sexual exploitation when it is sanctioned by authority. They remind us that the intersection of sexuality and power requires constant vigilance, lest personal desires again become instruments of public terror. In the end, Henry VIII's sexual practices stand as one of history's starkest warnings about the corruption of absolute power. A king who began his reign as a Renaissance prince ended it as a bloated tyrant, leaving behind a trail of broken women and a fractured realm. His obsessions had transformed England's religion, law, and society, proving that when sexuality becomes a tool of tyranny, entire civilizations can be reshaped by one man's ungoverned desires. The ultimate tragedy is not just the individual lives lost, but the systemic corruption that enabled and encouraged Henry's behavior. An entire nation learned to accommodate sexual tyranny, to rationalize murder as divine will, to sacrifice their daughters and sisters to a monster who wore a crown. The scars left by Henry's sexual obsessions would take centuries to heal, and in some ways, England still bears the marks of a king who confused his bedroom with his throne room and his desires with God's will.